So this is chapter 16. Daisaku Ikeda was the leader of, I'm not going to remember the name of the group, but it was an organization it was a Buddhist organization. I might have written it down in here somewhere. And we did chanting. So the epigraph is from him. Blocked waves double their persistence. So this is chapter 16. One day, while we were in a health food store, I saw a bulletin board note from a girl who was moving from Austin to Boulder and wanted someone to help with the driving. I had heard about Boulder. I heard about the mountains. I heard about Coors beer. I called the girl and offered to pay for gas instead of driving. Soon we were driving across the enormous flatness that is Texas. There's a crest on a hill right outside of Boulder, above which there's a scenic overlook. It's the first place from which you can see the town nestled up against the Rockies. Boulder wasn't very big then. It had all the natural beauty of the mountains and some of the culture of a city. It looked like a sanctuary. I was immediately enamored. While walking to a place for dinner, I passed a building from which I heard a low, rumbling group noise. I noticed it a few nights in a row, and then on my third night in town, two people approached me on the sidewalk in front of that building. "Would you like to go to a Buddhist meeting?" A fellow with bright red hair and pale skin and freckles asked ebulliently. He looked so happy, but I said no. In another block, I saw a girl with the same exuberant look. "Would you like to go to a Buddhist meeting?" It was too intriguing. I said sure, and followed her back to the building. There was a room full of people chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. There were members of a Japanese Buddhist sect, Nichiren Shoshu. When the chanting was over, they all jumped up and began to sing and wave their arms. One particularly energetic young man seemed to be the leader. He said, "If you chant, you can get anything you want, because chanting puts you in sync with the universal rhythm. Once you were in sync with that rhythm, you changed your karma and increased your fortune." A few other people in the room jumped up and gave testimonials. "Just try it and you'll see that it works." Of course, it wasn't so simple as chant and get what you want. You had to have a scroll and a place to enshrine that scroll. I was going to need an altar. You had to keep fruit and a vase with evergreen. You had to keep fruit and a vase with evergreen on your altar. Twice a day, you sat in front of the scroll, lit candles and incense, and read a sutra out loud. You had to do shakabuku, which is what the people who had invited me to the meeting had been doing, inviting me to learn about my Buddha nature. And you had to attend meetings. I moved into a room in a house with the woman who had taken me to the meeting. I bought an altar, I got a scroll. I was an enthusiastic member, driven by the idea that she could chant for things and get them. But what were the things I wanted? I wanted a job, an apartment, and a lover. Every evening I would wander the streets of Boulder asking people if they wanted to learn about Buddhism. If someone I invited came and joined, that was really good karma. And there were a few conventions that I needed to go to and a marching band that I was told I should participate in, despite the fact that I couldn't play an instrument. The only job I could find was washing dishes in the International House of Pancakes. I walked to work through Colorado blizzards. I went to Buddhist meetings every night and on the weekends. There was some attempt to teach Buddhist principles, but this was a perfect form for Americans. It was the spiritual path to more stuff. At meetings, we made jokes about chanting to get laid. I wanted a cowboy. After meetings, we went to... Actually, I think I was the only one making those jokes. Let me see. Oh, I'm pretty sure I was. After meetings, we went to local bars. A local bar, Shannon's. To enter, you had to push through two huge wooden doors. The weight of each seemed to challenge your intention to enter. Once in, your right to enter was decided by a man who checked IDs. If you were an insider, you had a regular's card, which you could flash. There were always people hanging around this guy talking, maybe a bouncer or a friend, but somehow their presence seemed to be a further challenge to your entrance. It was as if your identity as an insider had to survive their scrutiny. Soon I had a regular's card. There were two long rooms, the first with a bar to the right and a row of booths to the left. A row of tables and chairs drew a line down the center. A door in the middle of the wall across from the bar led to the second parallel room, which had a stage in the far end and a small bar at the other. The light was dim and smoke filtered. Being one of the only and certainly the biggest and definitely the coolest place in town, it was patronized by all types. Enclaves of bikers, cowboys, hippies, and mountain men collected in camps, each with a boundary drawn by vibe. The camps interacted for love and war, creating an atmosphere of potential promise and threat. There was music almost every night, the type of which would shift the balance of numbers in the camps. When Dusty Drapes and the Dusters played, Shannon's was a cowboy bar, at least in the room with the stage. Dusty had a slightly chubby, corn-fed look. His Stetson sat low on his forehead, and he looked up from under it with blue eyes and sang the sweetest cowboy love songs. I would light my filterless Philip Morris, take a sip of my Coors, and stare at him while he sang, trying to create a tunnel through which he would be pulled into my life. They played the country swing music of Bob Wills, a large following who dressed in cowboy clothes and came to dance the Texas two-step. My cowboy drag had Austin authenticity, but I felt every bit the queen of the ranch. But I wouldn't approach Dusty when he came to the bar. When you grow up being told that your body isn't right, when your body is hated and ridiculed, when your efforts to change seem never-ending and unsuccessful, when the people who are loved and desired in the culture look nothing like you, your body is just a problem. It's something to ignore. I lived in my head, always dreaming and longing, in a cloud of smoke. Dusty was a glossy face shining from the stage. When he got too close, I looked away. There was a young man in the Buddhist group. He laughed at my rowdy jokes about chanting up a cowboy. One night I talked him into going to Shannon's. I thought I might be able to flirt with him if I was drunk. He drove me there, but he changed his mind at the last minute and dropped me off at the door. That night I got drunk enough to ignore my fear, but not drunk enough to approach Dusty. A man flirted with me and we went to my place and had sex. It was easier when I didn't know the guy or care about him. He was another John Davidson, or David Johnson. Just a way to get it done. I knew I was pregnant. I knew that night. It was such a strong feeling, but I ignored it for a few months. When I threw up in the morning, I blamed it on too much gin from the night before. If I had been with the young man from my Buddhist group, I might have gotten married and had the baby, but it was clear that I was not emotionally or financially able to have a baby on my own, not to mention that I didn't know the father. By the time I decided to see a doctor for an abortion, it was almost too late. My abortion was in a clinic with professional people, but walking to work in the snow and smoking and drinking in a cowboy bar had worn me out. My health deteriorated. I became infected as a result of my exhausted immune system and a general lack of self-care. I ended up in the hospital late one night. I wouldn't go to work. I lost my dishwashing. Couldn't go to work. I lost my dishwashing job. I moved into a cheaper room in the basement of a house, which was always cold. I spent a few weeks living on soup that I made with ketchup, seasoned salt, and water that had been left in the kitchen by a previous tenant. For dessert, I would mix a spoonful of coconut and a spoonful of Hershey syrup together. One day, I stood up to answer the door, and I fainted. The friend who was at the door came in and helped me to the bed. She convinced me to call my mother to ask for help. I rarely called my mother. When I did, she was critical of my life, and we argued. I knew my friend was right. I needed to get some money, so I made the call. I told my mom that I was sick and I couldn't go to work, but I did not tell her why. She did send some money, not much. She felt I only called her when I needed money. She felt that giving me money would support my lifestyle. I was never clear what she meant by that. My life didn't feel particularly styled. I was going to have to find a job. A fellow Buddhist was the bookkeeper for a French restaurant, the Fleur de Lis. She asked the chef to give me a job washing dishes there. The chef's name was Paul Magnifico, a name that seemed to predestine him to the trade. He was passionate, deliberate, with a hair-trigger temper. He had fierce blue eyes and shoulder-length brown hair. He was a competitive runner and a bicyclist, so his body was solid muscle. There weren't many women looking for working in professional kitchens. I think that men needed to professionalize cooking in order to distinguish it from what their mothers, sisters, and wives were doing at home. So a woman trying to enter the field was under enormous scrutiny. Paul once told me that he worried that he would have to watch his mouth when I was in the kitchen, and he resented the idea. He used expletives to let off steam. He worried about it until he heard me call some built-up egg on the bottom of a pan that I was washing motherfucking shit. There was concern that men and women working in the kitchen together would develop romantic interests in one another and not do their jobs. There were many stories of sex in the walk-in. Sadly, none of them are my own. I did have crushes on all the men with whom I worked at the Fleur-de-Lis, all of whom remained unrequited, all of which remained unrequited. My crush on Paul enhanced my job performance because I was so desperate for his approval. When you crimp the edges of a quiche dough in a French quiche pan, the kind with the removable bottom, you pull the dough toward the edge and fold it back on itself. The dough pushed against the round edges of the pan forms those nice little rounded rims. But if you are not careful, the dough along the edge is thinned out and may crack. When the egg and cream filling is poured into the dough, it leaks through those cracks. If Paul filled the quiche before he put it in the oven, and if the dough was cracked, the filling would pour out onto the floor. If he filled it in the oven and it poured out into the oven, it burned on the floor of the oven and smelled, in his words, like a wet dog. Either way, Paul would pitch a fit. There was one fellow, Michael, who consistently ripped the dough. Perhaps he worked too fast, or maybe he just didn't care, but often when Paul used his doughs, they leaked. Doughs were rolled in the mornings to be used in the afternoon, so Paul might not know who had rolled a particular dough. Of course, if one leaked, no one wanted to admit to the inflamed Paul Magnifico that they had rolled it. One day, Paul tried to prove that it was Michael's doughs that were consistently leaking. He took one from Michael's hands that Michael had just rolled and poured water into it. The water streamed through the cracks. His point made, Paul hurled the ruined dough into the sink and stormed out of the kitchen. Michael went out to smoke a cigarette. When he came back, he asked if I wanted to learn how to roll dough. Michael showed me, and suddenly rolling dough was my new job. Paul came back into the kitchen and found me hunched over the quiche pan. He showed me how to do it with a little more care in terms of rolling the dough evenly from the start, so that there was enough to fold back without thinning the dough at the edges. His manner toward me reflected his doubt that I could actually do it. I proved him wrong. Eventually, he taught me to cook omelets, quiches, and crepes. He was calmed by my desire to please him, and he was a lot of fun when he was in a good mood. He loved Motown, so he and I sang while we worked. Paul forced me to taste things that I didn't think I liked. He would walk up and shove things in my mouth before I could protest. He always asked if it was good, as if my opinion counted, despite the fact that I had no experience of French cuisine. My grandmother had always cooked asparagus until it was mush. Paul shoved a piece into my mouth. I realized that I liked it when it still had some crunch. I liked cooking, and I was making money, more money, but I wanted to try and make enough to afford an apartment. I went to an organization that helped women to get jobs for which they might not be ordinarily considered. I thought I might like to learn carpentry. I pictured myself in overalls and construction boots, hammer in hand. They found me a job in a factory where camper trailers were made. It would be my job to put the wiring in breaker boxes. It had nothing to do with carpentry, but I was told I would get to work in the area where they did carpentry if I proved myself a good worker. The money was a little better than my cooking job, so I decided to try it out. Paul understood why I was leaving in terms of money, but he could see that there was a limit to how much carpentry I could learn making camper trailers. Paul thought of cooking as a craft, and he was trying to teach me that craft. There were other problems at the restaurant. Money was tight. We were all worried that our jobs might not last long anyway. There was really no carpentry going on in the factory. They used plywood to make the walls. They cut the wood in the area next to me. People who worked there wore face masks. I was only a few feet away, but with no face mask and the sawdust in the air. I was only a few feet away with no face mask, and the sawdust in the air started to affect my lungs. I developed chronic bronchitis. I was making more money. I moved into an apartment with a house on 9th and Arapahoe.